Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry we're getting a little bit of a late start, but we're waiting for everybody to join in and wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to get logged in before we got started here. So thanks for hanging in there with us and waiting, and we are going to get going. So we are here to talk about the 5 benefits to moving your enterprise fax applications to the cloud. And I'm sure many of you have already considered or maybe in some capacity have moved all or part of your fax infrastructure to the cloud. But today we want to talk very specifically about the benefits of cloud enabling your enterprise fax applications. So if you're faxing from JD Edwards or SAP or perhaps a healthcare application such as Epic or McKesson, we want to talk about the benefits of faxing directly to the cloud from those critical applications. And we're going to talk about the 2 primary ways you can do that with our partner EtherFax. So before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. You should see on your screen a Q&A window on the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to enter your questions in at any time during the presentation. And if we can, we'll try to answer those questions along the way, but if not, we'll certainly reserve some time at the end to answer as many questions as we have time for. And then rest assured, if we don't have a chance to get to your specific question, we will have somebody reach out to you and make sure you get the information that you need. So I am very happy to introduce today's speakers. We have 3 fax veterans with us today. Paul Benko, the CEO of EtherFax. EtherFax, one of the world leading providers of cloud fax technology and secure document transmission technology. Paul's going to talk about 2 key parts of the EtherFax solution that will help you cloud enable your enterprise fax applications very easily. And then my colleagues from Instant Info Systems, Ken Anaya and Juan Cueva, very happy to be joined by Ken and Juan. Both are 25-year veterans of the fax industry, and Ken has helped countless customers kind of determine what the best cloud solution is for their environment, and Juan and his technical services team have helped hundreds of companies make that transition into a cloud fax environment. So Ken will be sharing with us some of his real world examples with customers that he's been working with, and Juan will be on hand to answer any technical questions we may have about what that process is and what kind of services and support Instant Info Systems can provide. So without any further delay, I'm very happy to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ken Anaya.
Thanks, Julie. Your enterprise fax applications are too mission critical to rely on antiquated technology. They're mission critical because your apps are driving revenue, contracts, POs, invoicing. They streamline operations. They extend that workflow to your fax customer. They help you manage critical care. Healthcare organizations have authorizations, approvals, claims, all need to be faxed because it's still relevant. And they're the key to regulatory compliance. The date and time on a fax that's been sent or received can make the difference between meeting a deadline or staying in compliance or receiving a penalty. Most fax applications today are built on antiquated technology that's 10 plus years old, that have limited reporting, monitoring, and alerting, limited scalability, slow transmission speeds, poor resolution, and almost a throw it over the fence and hope that the fax goes out. I'm going to introduce Paul briefly. Paul, with EtherFax, you've replaced a lot of these old systems. Give us some thoughts on this.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks everyone for joining. Absolutely, and you mentioned that fax applications are built on technologies going as far back as 10 plus years. If we go back to fax and the inception of fax, it's been well more than 10 plus years, and the medium that the fax rides on, which analog telephony, has not changed for many decades. And that's where EtherFax shines, and we're bringing a modern transport to modern day technology.
Thanks, Paul. Today, your needs and requirements have changed. CIOs and chief security officers are requiring more details when it comes to your transmissions. They need to have that down to the minute information as far as, did we send the fax? Did we attempt to send the fax? Was it the right number? Or did a human answer the phone? So how do we overcome these current challenges and apply that to your technology that needs to be updated? Again, Paul with EtherFax, tell us more about that EtherFax platform and why it's so relevant today.
Great. So EtherFax, going back, as I had mentioned, is a modern transport built for today. The network is very highly intelligent, where fax is just a baseline for us. Going back to all the regulatory compliance, analog telephony or traditional fax telephony just does not meet the needs for today's businesses. So what is EtherFax? It's a cloud-based virtual telephony fax service that really connects your fax server application, your fax machine, any type of device to the cloud. There's no need for session border controllers. There's no need for fax over IP drivers, fax boards. We're using modern day technologies to go ahead and get that fax out the door. So why EtherFax? Well, we eliminate the need, as I had mentioned, for expensive fax hardware and telephony equipment. We're highly scalable. We utilize secure connections using government-grade encryption, and we'll talk about this much more in detail later on in the presentation. There's zero interoperability required, and we're one of only the few providers that are both HIPAA and Level 1 PCI DSS certified. So we're going to be talking about the two methods of direct fax integration. The first method that we're going to be talking about is the EtherFax integration module and then the API. Two different methods, obviously, for connecting to us. Some companies, choose to use the API if they want more control, and for other companies who don't, who do not have the resources to code and/or what have you, we've created a simple EtherFax integration module. So we're going to go into a live API demo here, and I'm going to take over control and actually show you the intelligence of the network here, so bear with me. Great, just want to make sure everyone can see my screen here.
Yep.
So this is our API is online. The URL is obviously up here. And for anybody who wants to test, we'll be more than happy to give you a free demo account where you can go in and test. I'm going to actually come back initial screen here. The introduction to the EtherFax API. So again, all the documentation is online. It's a real-time API that's direct into our backend. You have code snippets of anything and everything that you need. For people who are a .NET shop, we do have a NuGet package created that you can go ahead and automatically download. And that's actually, I can give you the URL for that. It's under authentication here. Bear with me, I apologize. Go back. So in the getting started here, there's a NuGet package that you can just download, and 95% of the code is already written for you. You can just download that into your VB.NET application. So we're actually going to go through a live demo here, and I'm going to show you the intelligence of the network. As I had mentioned before, fax is the baseline for us, and what you're about to see, no other platform and or service has the capability to do this. So I'm going to come into our routes info here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to authenticate. And let me just get my authentication credentials here. And what we're going to do is these are the same type of credentials that you would be receiving from us, and you would go ahead and simply put your authentication credentials in here as such. Thought I had these up, I apologize.
And there's two logins that our customers get when they're using the API. One is the credentials like Paul's showing today. The second one is to a very powerful dashboard where you can run reports and view all fax transmissions that you sent or received.
Right. So as you can see here, and I'll close my Outlook so we get no interruptions here. As you can see here, I did a login, and here's the action that I'm going to perform. And this is what all of our applications, including our devices, actually perform on the back end, if you will. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to put in a fax number, one that I know is an EtherFax fax number, and I'm going to 121538994. Nope, I need to log back in.
And when we work with our customers on the API, we're not just setting them off on this portal alone. We actually have the ability to bring our technical experts from Instant Info Systems, as well as our developer colleagues from EtherFax on the phone to uniquely work with you and your environment. You don't need to have a lot of coding experience. We're going to walk you through it. As Paul mentioned, there's a lot of samples out there that we can help you with as well.
Excellent. Yes, thanks, Ken. So as you can see here, I went ahead and I put in our authentication credentials, and I actually submitted a number to the EtherFax network. This all happens in real time. And the number that came back, we have a profile of that number, and we can see what type of accepted formats are valid for this customer, for this endpoint, and we can see that's an image or TIFF. This format is just a standard fax machine, this profile, and we're actually returning the name of the destination that we're sending to. So this could really help with your compliance in where that you can validate the receiving side that you're sending to prior to sending. If I go ahead and I put another number in here, and I do the same thing, now you see a lot more information here. So this device that I'm sending to, I already know happens to be a Lexmark fax machine. It tells me that these are all the accepted file formats. It can receive JPEG, gray color, TIFF, TIFF-FX. These are all of the types of resolutions that this type of application or fax machine could receive. And then we also notice down here that this device has a public key. So now we have the ability to not only send a high resolution color document to this endpoint, but it also accepts end-to-end encryption. And the device says, listen, I have encryption enabled, but it's not required. Some devices do have that they need both encryption and they want it to be sent, and that encryption is required. So if the sending device doesn't have the ability to do end-to-end encryption, this device would go ahead and reject the job. And this happens to be my fax machine at my house. And to give you an idea, yep.
Oh, go ahead. So, Paul, in an example where, let's say, you're a healthcare organization and you're faxing some very sensitive information from your primary location, let's say it's coming out of your ERP application, and you need to get a fax to a nursing station, a remote hospital, a remote location that has perhaps one of the Xerox EIP devices that can include this encryption. So what does it mean for that transmission now, coming from one point to another?
So not only from one point, not only in that example, but in any example, Ken, that when you have a fax that's traversing the EtherFax network, and we'll talk more about the ecosystem, that fax never hits a telephony phone line. So whether it's 1 page or 50 pages, it's an instantaneous transfer in a secure tunnel and has the capability to do end-to-end encryption. And to give you an example of what exactly that looks like, this is an actual high-resolution fax that's going through the EtherFax network, coming from various devices. We also notice up here that the status shows that it's SendX, which represents that was end-to-end encrypted. You can see this is a high-resolution MRI, as well as an EKG. And if you notice, the length that this fax took to transmit was about 1 second. So this is the power of the network. And as I had mentioned, fax, or traditional fax as we know it, is just the baseline for us. So as you can see here, as I had mentioned, on the API side, everything is online. And for you to do end-to-end encryption, you do not have to be a cryptographer. We have the ability, we wrote all the encryption libraries for you. Everything is right down in here, and the encryption libraries are all downloadable. We utilize the encryption scheme ECIES, which is also known as elliptic curve integrated encryption scheme. So it's a very strong encryption policy. This is primarily what Bitcoin and blockchain is all built on. So we've introduced this into the fax network. So I'm going to go ahead and give the presenter role back over here. And we'll start the PowerPoint up again for you.
Thanks, Paul. So as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I guess the second part of the integration with Etherfax is that Etherfax integration module. Paul talked about how easy that is to transfer from legacy fax applications to this platform.
Absolutely. So we've created the integration module for companies, as I mentioned before, who don't have the resources to do any type of coding and what have you. So for companies that are doing FCL, file drops, we've created a very simple, 5 megabit or less application that would go ahead and take those files that you're submitting to a file drop, and then the Etherfax integration module would go ahead and process them. And it's really highly flexible for any type of new formats that the integration module does not accept. You can go ahead and get us that file format, and we can generally have that turned around for you within 24 to 48 hours. It's a really nice little service / product.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Now, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we've identified 5 key benefits to bypassing the traditional fax server environment. The first one, starting off, is reducing points of failure. On the next slide, we're going to show a typical example of how many different jumps a document or fax has to go to from the originating source. In this example, it's JD Edwards, going to the fax server that jumps to the virtual fax board, to the media gateway, the CSU, to the carrier. Each of these different components has another potential point of failure. And we've seen with many organizations, although initially when the system is set up, it is perfectly fine, streamlined, very efficient. But things happen to the network. Things change. There's data that goes on the network that may interrupt the ability for the fax server to connect to that SQL database. Or let's say that MSMQ is offline, or you cannot write files to that NAS or SAN directory. That JDE application has no idea all these problems exist. The business has no idea that these issues are happening and that their fax may never have gotten out or delayed by 20, 30, 40 minutes. On the next slide, we know that typically the challenges that customers are having, an example here with our customer who had JDE, they were looking at a telephony environment that was changing out from under them. They had no control over this. Again, these are the fax server people, and the application or the people who manage the telephony decided they're going to go to SIP. Well, we all know there are challenges even with voice when it comes to SIP. Fax is also very challenging, and you really can't afford to throw your mission-critical fax applications on a SIP connection. These people that we worked with, they had legacy FCL commands with their applications. So they were dropping files to a folder that fax server was interpreting and sending out. But they didn't have a development team to work on that Etherfax API. That was a plan for the future. That wasn't something that they could do today. They needed something quick and painless. They had changes in their environment, of course, with that SIP coming down the path that they needed to get off of their traditional fax server. And they needed something that was cost effective, that wasn't going to cost them a lot of capital expense to move over to. So here's what we did with them. And Paul, this is very simple. Maybe you could talk to how we solve this problem.
So we took the existing file format that they have. We dropped the EIM service / product into their environment, ran a couple of tests. The EIM makes a direct connection back to the Etherfax backend, giving them all of the important information that they needed, completely bypassing fax server, and connecting to traditional telephony, utilizing the Etherfax network. This was a very, very simple and clean install for a very important and mission critical application. I remember pretty clearly the JD Edwards guys or the technical team on there were somewhat astonished or dumbfounded on how easy this integration or this replacement was, if you will.
And I think one of the other components that I remember was that their JDE people had to have a version of the fax client up and running to actually monitor their faxing. And it was very challenging for them to view the output of faxing and knowing which transaction was which. And that's a common problem with a lot of legacy fax applications, where it doesn't have that information coming back into the application to verify unique transactions. You wind up having to look at the list of faxes and actually opening those in order to tell which ones failed and which ones didn't. So this was definitely a good solution. It allowed us to bring Etherfax as an extension of their JDE application. They didn't need to rely on the fax server administrator to tell them when things were going right or not going well. I think we have another example of a customer challenge, and this second one that we've identified is gaining more intelligence about your fax transmissions, and I think that's key. We had an example of a customer, they're an auction house, they sell cars for a living on a wholesale basis, and they were integrating to the API of their legacy fax server. And the challenge that they were having, again, they were using SIP, was they weren't getting enough detail related to the actual transmission of fax. So they knew a fax failed, but they didn't know which fax failed, because they may be faxing the same or a bunch of faxes to the same destination. They were getting a lot of calls into their customer service saying, where's my fax? Whereas since they were sharing that fax server with desktop faxing, the application team didn't know if their fax was going to be delayed or not based off of the activity of customer service and their other faxing needs. So they're getting a lot of, where's my fax? And there was no clear method for them to identify those fax numbers that were bad and needed to be remediated or changed. Or it's possible their database had just the wrong number in it. So here's what we did. We integrated them directly with that API, and it bypassed that SIP telephony direct to Etherfax. And Paul, I think the success rate went up. And what were some of the other benefits of this integration with these guys?
Well, first and foremost, yes, the success went up. They were able to gain much more intelligence and insight into their fax transmissions, utilizing the Etherfax customer portal. Because we're going out over traditional PRI, their fax completion rates, as you mentioned here, went up from 83 to 98%. They had less support costs, less support calls, and overall, we just really enhanced and streamlined the entire business unit, if you will.
Hey, Paul, question came in. How are we able to tell that a fax success rate went up? Why is Etherfax different than our carrier on site?
So the first question there, I think you broke up a little, was how can we tell? Was that?
Yeah, how can we tell that there's a increased success rate, and why is the Etherfax telephony portion different than anyone else's on site that they can get from Verizon or AT&T?
Gotcha, understood. So yeah, so they were able to tell immediately that their success rate went up via the all of the meta and call detail information that we have within the portal. We were able to provide a much more, I should, if you will, for the lack of a better word, a understandable metric/dashboard. So they were immediately able to go in there and see that there was an increased success rate. Etherfax works with about 12 different carriers, from tier ones like Verizon's and AT&T's all the way down to the tier 2 and tier 3 providers. Etherfax has a very intelligent network. We know which numbers do better and have better success rates on certain carriers via certain routes. And we have the ability, or the network has the ability, to make intelligent decisions based on that. So we may be sending to a particular number that's in a real remote area, and maybe it's better over Verizon versus AT&T, and the network, the back end will automatically make those routes and changes, not having to have the customer do a single thing. So with Etherfax, you're getting many more networks, you're getting a much more intelligent network, many more providers to go ahead and get your success rate up. Keep in mind, Etherfax only charges for successful sent and received pages. So we're going to make sure we do, our best job in making sure that your fax gets, through successful.
Hey, Paul, a follow-up to that. Are these SIP carriers you guys use as well?
We do not use any SIP carriers whatsoever. Our network consists of the Brook Trout TR1034 board, so we do get V34 faxing, we do get error correction, and because of the amount of endpoints that we have within the Etherfax ecosystem, you're going to find that your 50-page fax is going through in seconds, 100% guaranteed delivery, error-free. We have the largest network, fax network, in the industry.
Thanks.
So you can take a look here. This is kind of a snapshot from our portal. Just a couple of transactions here, fax transaction reporting, and we have a wonderful ton of metrics in the portal. But again, this is just a snapshot of both your inbound and outbound history. You can see anything and everything from your connect time, remote ID, your pages delivered, caller ID, and your duration. Again, available to everyone in the Etherfax portal. You can even drill down to overall DIDs and looking at the success rate. And if you look down to the 25% there in the portal, if you actually hovered over the 25%, it would give you your error details. So we've tried 8 times. We've only got there, completed 2, and we've only delivered 5 pages. So if you highlighted it over 25 in the portal, it would actually give you the detail. But we're giving you this granularity of all of your transactions. And not only does it, make you more aware, but it allows us and the network to transmit or route calls more intelligently. We have all of the error description here for every single fax transmission, and that's available within the Etherfax portal as well. So again,
I think, Paul, as an example, sorry to interrupt, if you bring up a good point with that DID slide. We actually had a customer that was having challenges. They had one of the traditional fax servers. They had it connected to Cisco, which was going out of SIP connection. And that's what the environment was. They had to use it. The challenge they were having was they could fax every other number, and they were a hospital, but they couldn't fax to their surgical center. And if you can imagine, faxing to your own surgical center, that's a big problem, right? So, in fact, they found out that it was the technology at the receiving end at the surgical center that was the error, and they needed to change their line because the line was dirty. But the customer, the receiving end, the surgical center, they had no idea. So with Etherfax in kind of this level of detail based on DIDs, because every customer has an important customer list, you have to be able to fax to certain numbers without any excuse. This definitely information helps them identify that they're having challenges on their end. In fact, other people are likely having problems faxing them as well.
Absolutely. And we, we do our best, obviously, when you have 12 carriers to route through with several pieces of, with several methods or several different technologies or mediums on how to get there, and they all fail. it generally, leads to the receiving side, if you will. And absolutely that helps us in identifying, and we can certainly work with the receiving side. And 9 out of 10 times we find that these aren't the only issues that they're having.
Great. And these were those error codes you mentioned, so much more detailed than what our traditional customers are getting from their fax servers, because those are really diluted error codes. Well, tell us about what exactly you see here and what level this is in that transmission.
So we, these are traditional telephony error codes that everything is reported back in the API, regardless if you use the integration module and or the API. These are the error codes generally that we'll get back from telephony. We do some deciphering, but all of these things are audited, they're logged, and it just gives you a much better insight into really what happened to the call versus just getting that success and or failure. So again, much more level of granularity when you're dealing with EtherFax API and or the integration module.
Great. So our third benefit that we've identified is streamlining that fax transmission management. And this really goes to bringing under control fax as an extension of your application instead of fax as a separate application that you have to reach out to find out some more details about. So our customer challenge number 3, this one is a great one. It had a huge benefit because it was in healthcare. Customers were writing to their legacy fax server API using the COM module. Support was email only. The data and documentation was 10 years old. It was built on some very old code language, very limited responses back, and it just showed that the core application really wasn't built in the last few years. It was something that was retrofitted, from the 80s that they were trying to make current using a COM module. And their challenges were they really didn't get great details. All they knew was a fax failed. They didn't know fax failed human answer, fax failed line error, line busy, fax failed bad number, and they weren't really able to make smart decisions and leverage the information they're getting. And they thought that was all fax servers got you. So when we introduced the EtherFax API, I think it definitely changed their view on how they could leverage the information to help provide better patient care. And in that next slide, it shows these details. And Paul, I'll let you talk to this, but I think one of the benefits was they were never able to include in their API integration a unique transaction ID from the application. And when there was failures that came back, they never knew which failure it was for or which transaction. They just knew the fax number failure. And if they had sent 10 faxes, which is very common in healthcare, to the same number, they had no clue to know that it was regarded, my chart and my information or yours, Paul, and that caused a lot of problems, and that was also a compliance concern they had as well. But Paul, talk about that fax submission and that job ID.
So yeah, absolutely. So each job that gets submitted to EtherFax gets a unique GUID, and obviously that's the job ID on top. What Ken was referring to, a lot of customers use the tag field. And when you're submitting a job, you can submit your own unique GUID, your own tag, whatever other metadata that you want to submit with that job that will help you identify the actual job. The EtherFax API supports that. You can come into the portal, you can run reports off of that tag, you can run reports off of the job ID. You could also use the API to go ahead and query against any of your faxes with a certain individual tag in it. The nice thing with the tag field is the tag field doesn't necessarily have to be unique. The job ID that gets created is obviously always unique, but the tag field does not. So you can have, some jobs with the same tag field. It's really however you want to use it. So the API is extended, for such reasons.
Hey, Paul, we got a question that came in from the audience. Someone's asking, how does EtherFax report back to Epic when using the integration module to handle FCL files for outgoing faxes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I saw that question come in, and I'll have to defer to my support group. I'm on the sales side, so we'll have to get back to the person who had asked that. But I don't have the underlying technology or what it's how it does it. Although I know it does it.
Yeah, and I know that Epic has some very universal integration points where it's looking for notifications back. So maybe it's just a matter of connecting the data that we are collecting to one of those integration points that's kind of universal with all faxing applications. I'm sure it's an easy fix.
Right. Yep.
So the fax status or fax submission are you on, or fax status? You got that tag back that you mentioned before, the completion on. Tell me how important our healthcare customers, or in your experience, have really relied on that completion on stamp, which is very unique when it comes to EtherFax.
Yeah. So again, especially within healthcare, you get back all of the important information here. You'll see in this job that the tag was submitted. Now we're reporting back. We're reporting a fax result back of 0, which means it was a success. The page is delivered, the connect time, connect speed, and the actual completed on. Just like in the regular traditional telephony world, this is your fax confirmation, and this completed on represents that we've completed the transmission. The other side says it's received it okay, and this is what we're returning. So this is, very, obviously very useful. You need it. I mean, it's reported and returned back into the API. Again, you can query on anything, and these on any of the job IDs, on any of the tags, and what have you. And this is generally the status that you're going to get back. And this is truncated. There's a lot more information that you're able to get back in here, but we did truncate it, for the purposes of the presentation today.
Great. And speaking of that, you've got the newly updated dashboard, which I think is unique in the industry, Paul. I mean, you couldn't go to Verizon and log in and look at this type of data. This is really an important tool when it comes to management of the fax server and auditing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really excited about the new portal. Again, a wealth of information here. I'll just drill down to it into real quickly here. Daily history, past 24 hours. You can look at your current port activity. It's really important to understand that EtherFax is not a queuing or FIFO network. All right. You do get the advantages of a never busy inbound. But we're not going to, put you in a queue. You're not going to submit a fax and then wait 3 hours later for a confirmation, like a lot of the other services or platforms that are out there in the industry. So here you can see your DIDs allocated, your device connectivity status. If you have devices with EtherFax, such as the Lexmark devices, Xeroxes, you can manage them all right from within the EtherFax portal. You could take a look at your Secure Exchange Network faxes. These are faxes that never hit telephony. So again, whether it's a 355, 100, 300 page fax, that transmission is going to go instantly, 100% guaranteed delivery. We give you a nice breakdown on your call metrics, your last 30 days of faxes, and you can kind of get a breakdown of everything here. And again, you can drill down to it even more.
Paul, one thing that I know that our customers have loved about this tool is kind of back to in the traditional fax environment, when there's an issue sending a fax to somebody, you've got to almost replicate the issue. You've got to get a Wireshark. You've got to capture it again in action in order for anybody to believe it was a problem, and for any traditional fax server application to capture that information. You had that job ID that was on the last slide, and I know a lot of our customers can now go into here and find that job ID, identify that transaction, and when they're opening a ticket for support on the Instant Info Help Desk, how important is that job ID to troubleshooting any issues that you're having?
So the job ID is really nice because it allows us to drill down and search through millions and actually hundreds of millions of records within seconds. But we have the ability, and this is what's really great about the EtherFax support team. Our first level technicians are really engineers as well. They have the ability to go into our switches. They have the ability to run sharks and traces if needed, but the actual transaction ID just really helps them narrow it down much quicker. But again, and Ken and your team knows, give us a number, give us a time, and we'll be able to get through there and help troubleshoot anything in terms of transmission.
Yeah, and I think what's unique is that about EtherFax is, as you mentioned, these are a team of engineers. They're not customer service reps that are also going to answer your questions about billing. They are engineers that are here to troubleshoot the product, and I think that's one of the differentiators that EtherFax brings to the table that unfortunately is not realized by some customers until it's too late, but that definitely is a benefit that we do appreciate and we know our customers really value. So when we're talking about benefits, we talk about, again, talking about the EtherFax engineering team. EtherFax benefit number 4, improve security. Now, security is something that EtherFax takes very seriously because you've got customers in the government agencies, healthcare, financial services. You're always looking to get the best compliance and third-party auditing done to make sure that your systems are documented to be the most secure in the industry. Paul, can you talk a little bit about, on the next slide, the type of compliance and security that you have?
Sure. So EtherFax only utilizes Equinix data centers. We have 6 data centers globally, 3 in North America, 2 in Asia, and 1 in Europe. All of our data centers have gone through PCI Level 1 certification. EtherFax has also gone through PCI Level 1 certification. We're currently going through our 3.2 scope. We do have a third-party TrustWave HIPAA certification. We'll eventually be going through HITRUST certification. And our internet transport, if you will, it's a defense in depth, multi-layer, multi-level encryption utilizing ECC. It is a military grade type encryption. We also employ CIDR restriction rules. If you want to go ahead and lock down your transmissions to a certain IP, you have the ability to do that. We knew when we built EtherFax, we knew that our tires were going to get kicked and we had to come out with the most secure transmission that's available today. Again, we're a transient mechanism or a transient service, if you will. So any content that flows through our network, once the transmission is done, everything is deleted using FIPS 140-2 deletion methods. So it's very important to understand. We have no access to your images, to your faxes, what have you. So we talk about encryption, and you'll find in a couple of slides, you think of a company named EtherFax. How are these guys so good in encryption? You'll find out more in a couple of slides from now, but we do a lot of stuff or a lot of cryptographic work for the government. So we took a lot of the encryption schemes and a lot of the technologies that we've built, and we've, EtherFax has just happened to benefit from that. So we utilize what's called the elliptical curve integrated encryption scheme. Actually, it's with GCM, so it's signed and authenticated data. There's a public key exchange, there's encrypted using derived keys, and there's a shared secret. It's a hybrid encryption scheme. You can go ahead and you can Google and read more about this type of level of encryption. Again, the blockchains, the Bitcoins of the world all use this level of encryption. So we've integrated that into the fax side of things.
Paul, question that just came in. Who owns EtherFax? Is it another company or is EtherFax its own organization?
EtherFax is its own organization. So as I mentioned about—
No conglomerate?
Nope, it's privately held, own organization. So as I mentioned on the security, Etherfax and the partners and the engineers hold around 100 patents alone in security and messaging. So when we talk about security, we know what we're talking about. We're not just telling you that we're doing things over TLS and what have you, or we are secure. When it comes to security, we are the most secure internet fax transport that's on the market today.
So the fifth benefit is saving time and money. By integrating your fax applications directly to Etherfax, you're definitely reducing the costs associated with maintaining a fax server hardware, which may have been the right decision 15 years ago, but have since you've alternated to other types of technologies for your desktop faxing needs. But the application-based faxing, it just may not be necessary anymore to maintain that on-premise fax server with the maintenance costs and that software maintenance, the licensing, that the PSTN services, whether you're faxing or not, you're paying for those PRI lines, the T1 lines, they're out there, and all the hardware you have to maintain associated with keeping that connection up. And again, the FTEs associated with the managing the fax server, and if you've been had the fax server as long as we've been around, you've probably cycled a couple FTEs, and at times the person currently managing the fax server has very little information as far as how to actually troubleshoot and get you out of a jam. So that is a real problem for a lot of our customers out there. So the Etherfax service, it definitely allows you to do that transactional fee for faxing. You're paying for what you use. And Etherfax is not only an offering for a direct API or the EIM, but it's also part of a larger ecosystem of enabling major fax products on the market. Paul, can you talk about the ecosystem?
Sure. So as Ken mentioned, the Etherfax is an enabling technology for almost all of the major fax servers on the market. And this is really where the Secure Exchange Network came into play, where we noticed that a lot of our customers were faxing to other customers. We said, hey, why go ahead and go out the door and regulate this fax to a modem speed technology, having two modems hissing at each other, taking a beautiful digital document and then pixelating it. So that's where we created the Secure Exchange Network. And millions of documents, all types, whether it's a native PDF, a native TIFF, move through these applications and devices every single day. So that's how we say 100% guaranteed delivery to anyone within the Etherfax ecosystem. The ecosystem grows in order of magnitudes every single month. On average, we put around 20 to 30,000 numbers per month and add to the ecosystem here.
Thanks, Paul. So in summary, both of our organizations, both Instant Info Systems and Etherfax, we bring an extensive depth of knowledge and expertise in fax solutions and technologies. But more importantly, when you're choosing a cloud solution from Etherfax and Instant Info Systems, you benefit from industry-leading technology, world-class technical support, and the flexibility to implement a cloud solution that meets your needs today as well as the future. Not all cloud technologies are built the same. Etherfax is purpose-built. They were designed to send faxes first. They weren't designed to send file transfers, and then they kind of got into the fax business. This was ground-up built to send and receive faxes. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Julie.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ken and Paul. Really appreciate that in-depth presentation and the demonstration. And Ken, thanks you. I've been monitoring the questions as they've come in, and you've done a great job of fielding these questions as our audience has been asking them. So we don't have too many left over, but I did want to make sure a few of these do get answered. Quick, our typical housekeeping question, can I get a copy of the presentation? Just want to let everyone know that we will have a link to this recorded session available to you within the next 24 hours. And the recorded session will be better than the deck because you'll have the benefit of the live demo that Paul gave. So keep an eye out for that. We will be sending that out here in the next day. I think this is a really good question, and it just popped up as we were talking about this partnership between Etherfax and IIS. Somebody asked, who do I call if this breaks? Do I call IIS? Do I call Etherfax? And I think we still have Juan on the line, and I think he would be a great person to address kind of the service and support that IIS can offer in the event that a customer is in need of some technical support.
Sure. Sure, this is Juan, and absolutely, Instant Info Systems would be your frontline support, and we can work with you depending on what the integration is with Etherfax. As Ken was mentioning, we have many customers that have direct integrations with Etherfax through the API. We have other customers that have their fax applications that are integrated with Etherfax, and we're the frontline support. We're able to decipher, where the issue may rely. And then, if we need Etherfax, then we'll get them engaged in the back end. The portal's also a great piece of information, but that just gives you statistics. It gives you a whole lot of self-service through the Etherfax portal. But Instant Info Systems will be your front line.
Perfect, thanks. I wanted to make sure we were clear on that. Another question just came in. This is a more technical question. How does Etherfax handle inbound fax traffic to my application? Paul, do you want to address that?
Sure. So inbound would work the same exact way that you're accustomed to. However, you have access to thousands and thousands of ports within the data center. So that's how we tout the never busy option. It would be best, we highly recommend it, that you port your number onto the Etherfax network. Although we support remote call forwarding as a temporary option, we do not support it as a long-term option. We have 95% of North America covered. We're supported in 51 countries where we can do LLNP, but you'll be taking advantage of the highly available architecture within Etherfax if you do port your number over.
Perfect, thanks. And I know we're running up against the hour, and I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, particularly since we got a little bit of a late start. But there are two more questions that I think are worth sneaking in here, because I think a lot of people are wondering this. So how do I determine what is the best solution, the API or the integration module? And Ken and Juan, I know you've worked with so many customers kind of on these types of projects and have helped make that determination. Do either one of you want to address that?
Yeah, let me start. I guess it's all depending upon where your organization is and what type of data they need from the transactions. And we can go in either the API direction or the FCLs. And, it's a lot to do with your CIO and your security officers saying, we need this data. And a lot of our customers are taking advantage of that API if they have the development resources available. And Juan, can you talk to the FCLs as far as the customer's choice on that? With the
I think the main determination there too is also, do you have the ability or do you have the resources in the back end that develop those original SCLs or that initial application? So what we've done with some customers is we've been able to just take the file that gets dropped, and without making any changes, just take that file and interpret it with the Etherfax integration module and be able to just drop it to a directory similar to how they're doing today, and then have that utility, that small utility that Paul talked about, do the interpretation, then transmit the job via Etherfax in the back end.
Great, thank you both. And then I want to thank the attendee who asked this question, because I think it's a great way to just wrap up our whole presentation. Their question is, if I fax directly to the cloud, do I still need my fax server? So great question. Ken, Paul, I think any one of you could address this.
Go ahead, Paul.
So the question was, if I fax directly to the cloud, do I need my fax server?
Right.
If you want to utilize the API and or the Etherfax integration module, the answer would be no, you do not need it.
Great, very short answer. I think it's probably worth pointing out though, and maybe Ken, you can speak to some specific customer examples where for the application, the actual enterprise fax application, the fax server would not be needed, but I think you probably have some customers that do retain their fax server for desktop faxing applications and other aspects of their business. Would that be true?
Yeah, absolutely, Julie. So for the application teams who are looking for that direct extension of their application, the EtherFax API is where they're kind of peeling off that integration. But they definitely may have still a desktop faxing need, and with organizations moving and needing the integration to Office 365, it's something that they're evaluating to see, well, is my on-premise fax server still something that I want to move forward with, given the shifting to cloud environment? And that's where if the on-premise solution is something that's not something you're looking to move forward with because of the maintenance and the cost and the PRI and stuff, we have a variety of solutions we can couple with EtherFax that would give you a 100% cloud presence if that's what you're looking for. And we have a number of products that we can offer for that and make sure that we're providing you the right product with your very specific requirements.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that was a great question to sort of round out our presentation today. So I want to thank our presenters, Paul Banco, Ken Anaya, and Juan Cueva. Thank you very much for taking the time to go through this really important information. And most importantly, thank you to our attendees for taking time out of your day and joining us today. I hope you found the presentation informative and useful. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out a recording of this presentation shortly. But of course, if you have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. You can see our contact information there. We've got fax specialists waiting on the phone to take your call and answer your question. So with that, I will wish you all a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.